Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. We do appreciate. Sorry for those little hiccups there at the beginning, but we are very pleased to be joined today by Najat Khan. She is the CEO and president of Recursion Pharmaceuticals. It's an AI-driven drug discovery company. Najat, very versed in this field. She's going to be sharing firsthand insights on how artificial intelligence is impacting, the life science industry at the moment. Transforming drug discovery, R&D strategy, basically the future, future innovation across the industry. So we are very, very excited to have her to join this first. We hope, several practice academy forums hosted by pharmaceutical executive and co-hosting with others like today we have Young and Partners. Peter Young, the CEO of Young and Partners, is co-hosting. So we are real excited. We hope you enjoy. Thanks again for joining. Stay tuned for other forums in the future. And now I'm going to hand things over to Peter, who is our moderator.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Well, first of all, I want to welcome all of you who are joining us to hear this webcast. I'm very excited about it on an important topic and with a very, very knowledgeable speaker. Before we start, though, I just want to say that, first of all, we're also pleased to be co-hosting this event with Michael Christel and Pharmaceutical Executive. I've been on the editorial advisory board for as long as anyone can remember, and we love to contribute articles to the magazine, as we will be on M&A and the strategic changes in March. This series is really designed in order to try to take thought leaders and on topics of great interest to the C-suite of the biopharma industry. And what I would like just to say is that we will have we're going to divide the session. First half will be the industry as a whole. So I'll ask Najat her view about how AI is affecting the life science industry as a whole. So she's going to put her big picture hat on and think about the different parts of life sciences and the different disciplines, because obviously the impact on R&D versus sales or procurement, regulatory can be quite different and is quite different. And then we'll take the remaining part and dive deeply into what Recursion's doing and what Najat is doing as the CEO of Recursion. We are going to leave some time at the end for Q&A. The way we're going to do this, though, is there is a chat function, a Q&A and a regular chat function. If you have a question, just type in your question. In fact, you can type it in anytime. You could type it in, 5 minutes from now. And when we get to the point where Q&A starts, I'll be able to see the questions, and Najat as well, and I'll pick the ones that are most interesting. As a famous speaker once said, please form the Q question in the form of a question. So we would appreciate that. Of course, he also said that please form all questions in the form of praise, but we're not going to follow that. That's his rule there, he says. So with that, Michael already gave a little brief bio of Najat, so I won't repeat it, but she's really had a very, very long history involved with AI, but more importantly, the whole use of data in the industry. And before she joined Recursion, and she recently became CEO, she was with J&J doing a lot of the same kinds of things, but focused a lot on the drug development side. So AI, you can't pick up a newspaper without reading something about it. And I think there are a lot of things that are true, and there are a lot of myths about it. Everyone's wondering when the bubble might burst or whether it won't burst. I think it's a lot more nuanced. I think it's one of those things where, depending upon what category of the industry you're talking about and what part of the supply chain of AI you're talking about, the future may look quite different. The future from NVIDIA's point of view is quite different than people who are building data centers or people who are making products or whatever it may be. So I think there's no one size that fits all, but I think things are shaking out. So it is clear that certain functions are more amenable to being to AI than others, and hopefully we'll explain to that. The good news, or at least I think it's good news, is life sciences is probably cited the most frequently as an industry that will benefit from AI. I personally believe that that's true. And a lot of it has to do with the structure and the nature of the drug industry, what it does on the regulatory and the discovery side. So let me start out and say, Najat, taking your big picture, is it a bubble or is it a partial bubble or does it depend upon what part, what industry and what part of the value chain you're talking about? What's your personal view?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And it's something that you said. I think it's much more nuanced than just one bubble. Like if you think about AI, there's multiple layers that we talked through. One is really just the infrastructure itself. You mentioned a lot of the data centers, et cetera, that are being built. Then there's another layer around the chips, of course. Then there's another layer in terms of a lot of the data and the models that we're seeing. And then there's the application there. So just, as a high level structure. And I think where the bubble element, or is there a partial bubble, the question around all of the infrastructure being built in the data center is that there's a ton of activity, right? There's a lot of money being invested. And the question is that matching sort of the monetization of the AI application, the top layer that you're seeing? And I think there's a bit of a lag, quite frankly. And there's a lot of question marks in terms of where is the ROI being driven at that top layer from an application of AI perspective. And look, it breaks down in different ways from different industries. I think in the life science and healthcare space, so much of it is reliant on the data. And of course, the models, but the data that's being generated, the data that's being aggregated. I think that's where the question comes from. And what I would say is we need to keep our focus when it comes to AI, just like any other tool or solution, is what is the outcome that it's driving. Then, if you look broadly in the pharma space or the life sciences space, I think 2 years ago to now, in terms of the outcome that is driving, you're starting to see what I like to call green shoots in R&D, molecules that are being designed that have never been designed before. And some of those molecules starting to show some activity in diseases that we have never seen before. So just park that just as a quick idea. I think on the manufacturing front, there's a lot of green shoots, as I like to call it, in terms of the use of AI. Being able to optimize your runs, production, quick ROI, and you see a lot of large pharma companies starting to invest in that space, which I think makes a lot of sense. And then also some early insights on the commercial front. I mean, look at the work that Open Evidence and Abridge and others are doing in terms of really changing the point of care for patients. And a lot of that is AI and underlying AI features in that. So different areas that you're starting to see across the value chain. There's much more to be done. I think, there's a reason why healthcare always takes a little bit longer time to kick off. Some people call it the regulations. I think in this case, it's also just the data and the aggregation of data and being able to measure the adoption and ROI. I don't think we're at that bubble yet from a life sciences and healthcare application layer perspective. But I think a lot of the infrastructure and data center, the question mark is out there. If it doesn't match ROI, is there a lag time? And therefore, should we match that build more of what you're seeing from a monetization perspective on the first layer? I think there's a question mark out there
Yeah,
overall.
that's right. Yeah, and actually, if you look at the big picture, I agree with you. And if you look at the big picture, at that current space of AI, what is it good at? It's good at taking data and looking at patterns and creating insights. But the reality is it's only as good as the data, right?
Yep.
So one critical factor, and this is one of the reasons why life sciences is a great application, is life sciences compared to most industries and applications has good data, right? Pristine data. There are a lot of applications of AI that will never really be very good because the data is not very good, right? And so it's only as good as the data. Now, I say at this present time, because the AI is evolving, and it may be that They develop the models to help compensate for bad data. But at the current stage, it's only good. The other thing I would say, and the reason why I happen to believe there's a bubble, but like you, I think the bubble, it depends on where. Some places a bubble, some places not bubble. And I was giving a speech and we talked about AI and someone raised their hand and said, well, gee, you say you're not sure that AI will be successful and all that, but look at how many people are using it. And my response was, it's amazing how many people will use something that's free. If you look at it, the CEO of Microsoft was asked recently, saying, well, you're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on this. How are you going to measure and are you going to get a return on that investment? And he was honest. He said, today I cannot tell you I'm going to get a return. I believe that there'll be certain areas where I'll get a return, but I can't tell you today that all the money we're spending, we're getting a return. But I can tell you that if we're not in the game now, we
That's it.
won't get a return. So he's saying, part of this is like going to Las Vegas, right? And I don't really know what my odds are. So it's very interesting. But then there are some sections of healthcare that clearly AI will be extremely. I would not want to be a radiologist today. Why? Because AI is wildly applicable and powerful in analyzing X-rays and MRIs, right? It is a great application because of the data and the kind of algorithms you have. But there's one extreme example where AI can really be. But walk through it. You talk about manufacturing, you talk about R&D, you talk about, how about the regulatory side? How do you apply AI to the regulatory side? I mean, drug discovery, you have all these molecules, you have data, so forth. That's easier to understand. How about the regulatory side?
I'll come to that. Maybe just reflecting on two things you said, Peter, around the piece around data and life sciences, the quality of data. I think is variable. Like if you look at biology, the amount of data that you have that's amenable to building an algorithm to figure out novel targets or novel drivers of disease is very limited. I mean, think about going back to lab. A lot of it is like very artisanal, bespoke, one mouse assay, one binding assay. It's incredibly fragmented. So I think for biology, where 90% of biology is unknown, you actually have to create the data. That's where you see, a lot of the public-private consortiums or a lot of the efforts like Arc Institute and others, it's focused on generating, or even what Recursion has done, is focused on generating the data to actually go from the vast unknown to create more structure and to actually build models so you can uncover the unknown to known. So I would say in biology, it's a very different kettle of fish. I think when you come to the chemistry side, the amount of data is a bit more structured, true. And I think where AI algorithms are really good is to take the 10 to the 60th permutations, combinations of atoms and such that can make small molecule to make sense of that. That's why you're starting to see compounds being designed that have never been designed before. I think the data is there, but it's actually a little bit easier in terms of making those models. What's not easy though, you can design a cool looking molecule, but guess what? You can't actually get vendors to synthesize it or yes, you can make it on paper, but you're not thinking about absorption in the body, off-target tox. Like there's a lot of other, how do you make it drug-like from a nice compound to making it actually a drug that I can take or you can take that will stay in the body for the time it needs to, goes where it needs to, and actually does the action you need. And then, so just coming to regulatory now. I think on the regulatory front, look, the FDA and other regulators for the last year and a half has shared a lot of guidance in terms of real world data, patient data, methods and how to do it, right? Like how to use it. I think that's progressed a lot. And I give them a ton of kudos for doing that, which gives a blueprint for how we use it. Like I'll give you an example. We just had the first clinical POC for recursion from our platform in a disease called FAP, where basically the hallmark is hundreds of polyps in your colon, where there's 100% risk of CRC, colorectal cancer, if left untreated. We have a drug for a disease that has no approved drugs, only surgery. taking your colon out, taking your rectal pouch out. These are horrible diseases. Where regulators have made a difference is these are open label studies, single arm studies, using real world data to contextualize what's the care of patients today. What are the methods to do that? So there is a blueprint to how you can use that real world data to actually contextualize what patients are, how they're being treated in the real world, and use that as supplemental information when you go for submission and so forth. That did not exist some years ago. The data didn't exist, the methods didn't exist, the guidance didn't exist. So I think there's been a lot of progress there, but it again comes back to the data. Where are we seeing longitudinal good patient data that you can use? If you think about the healthcare system today, care is so fragmented. Hospitals don't talk to each other. I mean, if I asked you for the last 50 years, Peter, do you have a perfect record of every drug you've received, every patient or physician visit you've had, lab results you've done? You probably don't have it. So that's the kind of data that regulators want to understand how patients are doing. And that data is hard to find because we don't capture data that way today. There's a lot of companies working on it, but I would say that's one of the rate limiting steps. The methods are getting better, the guidance is there, but it's getting down to the data because it's so fragmented.
If we step away for the moment from your core, career in drug development, so forth, and just talk about patient care, because you're now talking about hospitals and doctors
Yeah.
and so forth. Let's put drugs aside and just say, let's talk about what is the potential for either reducing costs or improving patient care in patient care settings such as hospitals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And you have a view on that? Because I know you think more than just your core business, right? When you think about this issue.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the ways we can actually reduce or improve care and reduce the cost is a better understanding of the totality of care for a patient. And the fragmentation is a huge challenge. I mean, think about it. You go to a specialist, and they usually don't have the entire context of all of the physicians, all of the medications you're taking, and so forth. So we end up doing a lot of rinse and repeat, right, with patients, asking them to fill out forms, asking them to re-answer questions. Patient navigation, I was part of Cancer X back in the day. Patient navigation, when you become a patient and navigating whether it's cancer treatment or IBD, is incredibly hard to do. So that's number one. I would say number two is matching the right drugs or matching the right procedures to the right patient. There is so much trial and error. It depends so much on the physician you go to, which zip code you live in, which I think is terrible for the patients that need treatment. And why is that happening? That's happening because of the fact that we don't match. For instance, if a patient has a certain mutation, we should match the drug to that patient. But guess what happens? That doesn't happen. Or match them to the clinical trial that would be appropriate for them. It only happens if you're lucky enough to have a physician that actually knows that. If you go to a community clinic, very different standard of care. And then guess what? Pharmaceutical companies complain that only 4% of the addressable patients for a clinical trial get in that clinical trial. Look at the gap. Why does that gap exist? Shouldn't it be easier to connect the dots? That's the whole point. It is so fragmented that patient care and clinical care are wildly disparate in our system. And that increases cost and it reduces the effectiveness of the care that you can get. So I think there's so much work to be done to improve that. And one of the ways is to connect data sets, but the other is incentives, Peter. Why does it not happen? Are physicians incentivized to match a patient to the right care or to the right surgery? And do they know the latest and greatest of every medical care that's happening? No. And I think this is where a lot of the, whether it's the passive sort of AI that works where it can actually do your notes for you if you're a physician, reduce pajama time, as they call it for physicians, and actually more automatically suggest what are the trials that the patient is appropriate for. All of that AI is starting to play a role, but we need to do a lot more there. We need to incentivize patients. We need to make sure they're rewarded the right way. We need to make sure physicians are. I mean, there's so much work to be done.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because yeah, people don't spend as much time talking about patient care. They like to talk about the invention process, but the reality is the potential is extraordinary. And
Yes.
and particularly on the cost side, I mean, in this country, we're I don't know, number 17 in terms of quality of healthcare, but we're number one on cost, which is really, you don't want to have that ranking, right? You don't
Yeah, and
want,
if you look at the ratio, Peter, we are one of the worst
yeah,
in terms
absolutely.
of the cost of care versus the impact. That's crazy. Like Singapore is far better than us. Why? Closed loop system.
Yeah,
All the data is integrated. Physicians talk to each other. They're incentivized to improve care
right.
by actually, putting the patient first. We don't do that here.
Yeah. Speaking of geography and geopolitical, uh, one of the big debates currently is who's going to win the AI war. Will the Chinese win or the US? And the US having OpenAI, and Anthropic, et cetera. The Chinese having their DeepSeek and so forth, and open architecture, so forth, open source, so forth. And reasonable experts are arguing both sides as to who's going to win. But if you then move beyond that and look at the life science industry, there's this huge competition between China and the US now. The Chinese
Mhm.
are moving very, very rapidly,
Yep.
partly related to availability of data, regulatory, whatever. So do you have any sense for, putting aside the regulatory system, just do you have any sense for whether the Chinese are going to get an edge in AI as applies to life sciences or not, relative to the US and Europe?
I think absolutely.
Mm,
I think, look, when I go back to the stack layer that I mentioned, like infrastructure, data center, they are building it so much faster. They have so much more capacity. We're building it to create it. They already have it. I mean, Wang from Jensen from NVIDIA has mentioned that many times. I think where we need to compete, I mean, we need to do all of that, but we need to compete is really on the AI application layer. And look, if you look at a lot of the hospitals in China, they're like top tier hospitals with good integrated data sets. That's why even biotech companies are starting to run their trials, or at least the initial go, no go phase one trial in China. That trend has really picked up in the last year. Why? Faster, cheaper, high quality. I
yeah,
get a go number really fast. Why is that? What is the underlying feature of that? High quality of care, but good data quality, data sets, and so forth. And that's what models are built on.
yeah. And the Chinese have better control of their data than we do, right?
And exactly. And also, the entire country is focused on being a leader in the biopharma, biotech, whatever you want to
Right.
call space. And they also have really good AI leaders. And there's a lot of talent from the US going to China and building that out. So I think they'll absolutely be a force to reckon with. When I step back for a second, I focus more in terms of like, what's our end game? And our
Yeah,
end game is 80% of diseases don't have good drugs for patients.
right.
Though there's a huge amount of white space. So the question we have to ask ourselves is where do we collaborate? Where do we compete? But the ultimate goal is we all have to make more drugs. There's enough place to play in. That's not the challenge, but how do we ensure that we're balancing where we collaborate versus where we compete? And I think the AI application layer absolutely has to be an area where we compete and other areas that we collaborate. But and it's not just China, if I can say, like the progress from a biotech perspective and the Asia Pac region has also evolved in the last 5 years. The
Oh,
competition is fierce. So it pushes us to work on areas that are truly novel, higher risk when you're doing more novel, higher reward for the patients, and you need investors that are going to stay in the long haul. Because when you're doing more novel, it's just more, there's higher risk, it takes longer, and so forth. What is the appetite of the investor base in the US?
yeah.
Right? Like,
And
so there's a lot of questions there. And at Recursion, for instance, one of the things that gets me excited is we focus on decoding biology, that unknown that I just talked about. That's where it all starts. You find novel targets. That's how you compete to win. We can build compounds, and we've done it multiple times. We synthesize 90% less compounds than industry on benchmark. We do it in half the time because we're using chemistry and AI and then going into the clinic. And maybe we can partner with China and other areas in terms of getting a early signal, go, no go. So this is what I mean. Where do you compete? Where do you collaborate? But the ultimate goal has to be to get better drugs for patients. And I think there's enough space for all of us to make an impact.
Yeah, and it's not helping that we're driving a lot of Chinese and Chinese Americans, to China because they're in a hostile environment. By the way, so I run a firm that does investment banking and consulting for life sciences and chemicals, and we did analysis or a detailed analysis of AI and how to apply it to our business, and we realized that uh, separate from just some of the cost reduction, automating certain, just information searches, it didn't really apply. And why? Because we have proprietary data, but the nature, if you tried to use it so that it create a revenue stream, you're essentially giving others access to your data. So we shut it down because we said it doesn't make business sense. And I think the other part is taking the big picture, as you say. This country really has to take, and the West, all the West, not the US, but the West has to take a hard look at the approach we're taking to AI in general, but also in life science, and say, how do we end up winning this? Because the electric vehicle thing, we've lost, right? I mean, the CEO of Ford went over recently, drove around in a Chinese electric vehicle, went to their plant. He came out, told reporters, said, I can't compete, which was astonishing. I mean, he literally quoted, he says, we can't compete. And we just don't want to be in that situation in life sciences down the road, right?
Yeah.
Or in AI. By the way, just a small personal story. One of our friends, their son is like co-head of R&D or something for Anthropic, one of the two leaders. We went to his wedding, and he was married to a woman who was unbelievably smart, and he's unbelievably smart. There are 200 people at the wedding. 100 were all the people who worked for him. So all I could say is that I had the most interesting discussions over dinner of any wedding I went to. Can you imagine
Yeah.
100 AI experts, at this wedding? I got to tell you, it was a memorable wedding. Now, I want to switch over to Recursion. Before that, though, I want to, talk a little about your personal story, a little bit about Najat. I happen to know, we know each other personally. Tell the audience a little bit, how did you get into this crazy business? I mean, tell us a little bit about your career. We know you got a PhD, but that doesn't make you any different from anyone else. Tell us a little bit about the history, and then we'll talk about Recursion.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, the history is like I can tell you the history, and retrospectively, when you tell your story, it all makes sense. It makes perfect sense.
Right.
But I'm going to say it more prospectively, so I'll give you a little bit of insight into intuition and kind of curiosity more so than a real strategic plan. Look, for me, growing up, my parents were both physicians. Dinner table was talking about what my dad saw as a trauma surgeon that day with a patient, or my mom saw as a radiologist. And radiologists, my mom actually was a gynecologist who mid-career became a radiologist because she truly believed that technology would enable her to do a better job of treating her patients.
Yeah.
And so a little bit of that comes from the purpose for me always has to be to help patients. It is the worst when you're sick. You're the most vulnerable. You're at your darkest hour. And I think there's so much we need to do. It's the highest calling personally for me. But I think very early on, I saw the fact that the combination of understanding science, and there's so much gap. Like, think about our biology books. Pathways are hand drawn. Hand drawn. Like, that is as imprecise as it gets. And
Right.
super complex, and you have to learn and memorize all these words. It's not logical. So that's number one. And 2000s and so forth, you see, I mean, yes, there was a dot-com bubble, but you can see how computation is going to make inroads. So I taught myself to code when I was like 5 years old because I thought it would really make a difference. And I love learning languages. So it's a different way of understanding logic. Those two things coming together with this kind of core, like my parents being physicians, and how do you improve the patient experience? Medicines, surgeries are a means to doing that, but the end goal is the patient being better. So then when I came to the US, when I was 17, I actually did pre-med in undergrad, did comp sci, did business, which everybody was like, why can't you stick to one thing? And I was always like, well, what's the fun in that?
Mhm.
Because unlocking something else is when things come together. And very few people do that. So I think I naturally gravitated towards it, although it meant that I had to take 7 a.m. chemistry classes and I had to take evening classes on coding. Like it was just, my schedule was a mess. I partied less, Peter, but I partied enough in college.
Oh, come on. I can't believe you didn't party at all. Come
I
on.
partied enough. I
A
said
little
enough,
bit. Yeah.
enough, but not
You allocated some time for partying, right?
exactly. But I could have had a lot more fun. I had friends who had a lot more fun because I had all the labs for like the sciences, the labs for comp sci. They were like, "What are you doing?" But coming out of that, my mom got diagnosed with Parkinson's at 49. And I was just like, every doctor I spoke with, there was no drug. 20 years later, I'm sitting here and talking to you. No, zero disease modifying drugs that have been launched for Parkinson's. It's terrible. And so for me, that's when I was like, you know what? I could be a doctor, but what I really want to be is somebody that enables medicines to be made for drugs and for diseases that don't exist today. Kind of that's the path I took. And so then I ended up doing my PhD and I had a PI who, by the way, put up with the fact that I was a big believer of designing molecules in silico before making them in the lab, which was a weird idea back then.
Right.
I was made fun of. Like, why are you so odd? And I finished my PhD in 4.5 years, but those two, like the comp sci and then the chemistry background, really helped. And I worked on designing molecules and doing all of the in vivo work in the oncology space and diagnostic space. Then I ended up going to BCG. You know why? Because I was like, I get how these two disciplines come together. I don't understand the business of healthcare.
Yeah.
It's something you and I just talked about. So
Yeah.
I worked in the hospital space, payer provider space. I worked in the pharma space. It gave me a full 360 view of what a patient care actually looks like, starting from invention all the way to improving a patient's life.
So
And
a lot of your clients were life science clients.
life sciences,
Yeah.
payer, and provider. That's the beauty of actually working in a company like that because you get that full-on perspective. I left as a partner 7 years later and I joined J&J because I said, okay, great. I understand healthcare. Now I want to really understand how one of the premier companies that has a patent cliff coming builds a pipeline. So I did two jobs there. I was the global head of our R&D strategy and portfolio. So the job is how do you build a pipeline and continue building a pipeline? It's a combination of understanding R&D, commercial, and financial allocation. And then I also was the chief AI officer. So I built the AI group from scratch, scaled that across R&D. But here's the interesting thing. People were like, Najat, why are you doing both jobs? Do one. But again, Peter, what we just talked about is AI without a purpose,
Right.
without a problem is useless. And a pipeline without using AI is useless because you know this is where the world is going, and now even more so. So I had the privilege of combining the two organizations. And then the next thing brought me to Recursion because I said, I can see the impact. If you're in a company that's super successful, like your GM Ford example. But guess what? If you build AI from the ground up, that's where the true disruptive companies come from.
Yeah.
Like Tesla wasn't born in GM for a reason. Because you got to break how you think about the whole area. But you still need to know how to make a car at the end of the day. You need to have the respect for that, but you need to do it differently. And that's what brought me to Recursion.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, and I'm also a firm believer in what you said, which is that most things in life, if there's no cross-functional understanding, your odds of success go way down. I have a
Yes.
tremendous respect for R&D people, but I have incredible respect for either R&D people who also have a business perspective, right? And
Yeah.
but also companies where maybe the R&D people don't, where they organize the company in a way so that the business people have a healthy relationship with the R&D people, and they,
Mhm.
but there was a famous story of how R&D people can get like totally off. I remember I met the guy who was a project manager for Teflon, right, at DuPont. And he said the R&D people came to him and said, "We've done it. We figured out how nothing sticks to this." And he said, "Well, I just have a simple question." And they said, "It's great application, jet engine blades, pots and pans and so forth." And he said, "Well, I just have one question for you. I know you're really excited. How does it stick to the pot and how does it stick to the jet engine blade?" And the R&D people, they're so fixated on the fact nothing stuck to it, they forgot that, in fact, if it didn't stick to anything, you didn't have a product. So they went back, and a couple of years later, they figured out how to have it stick. But there's an example of R&D gone amok. You know what I mean? Losing touch with the business, aspect. So now recursion. Let's talk about recursion. And by the way, I'll remind the audience to type in questions along the way, and we'll be able to see them. So you went from J&J. By the way, one of our, as you know, our senior guys was head of pediatric drug discovery at J&J, and then went on to be deputy commissioner FDA. Why is that? And that's probably was also a big transition, because going from a large company to a smaller growing biotech, that's also a big change too. So tell us about, you explained why you made the change from a business point of view. What does the change feel like, going from a large company down to this? It's different, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's different. It is different. But what didn't feel different, surprisingly, was, at J&J, when I built the data science team, it was about 260, 70 people, very fast moving. It was building a company in a large company, and I built it from 5 people. And, I love the pace with which you could move in terms of what we can do. And it's very similar at Recursion. Like, I came in, within a couple of weeks, we decided we're going to acquire this company called Exec, which was an AI chemistry company. The fluidity with which you can move, the conviction with which you can make decisions, the limited bureaucracy is fantastic. I mean, that's how you really create change very fast. I'm also so impressed by the teams, so mission driven, incredibly mission driven, right? It takes a certain type of person to really take on the risk that comes with any biotech. But then you're adding the tech component. Like, there's almost no company like us that exists today that has an end-to-end AI engine from biology, chemistry through to the clinic. That doesn't exist. And that has a clinical stage pipeline now with our first clinical POC that is really, good partnerships with Roche, Sanofi, and others that's progressing well. It's a very different type of company. I will say, look, from another change perspective, from a large company, there is a lot of governance. There's a certain way you do things. There is a lot of infrastructure in terms of how people are coached and mentored and managers. And I think there is a lot of benefit to that I'm trying to also incorporate in Recursion. But quite frankly, the change has not felt jarring. It's felt very fluid and something I probably yearn for, because, in a space like AI that's moving so fast, you just mentioned, Peter, you pick up a paper or, whatever you're reading, your phone, there's a new model being built. There's a new data set being created. It moves so fast. And I think
Which also makes it very hard if you're running a business, right? Because a lot of the things you don't know how it's going to change. So I guess you have to be. Now, Recursion it's been hot, and there are times where it has been not. Tell us a little about that. What it's been a little bit of, I mean, the trajectory has been up, but it's been a little bit of a roller coaster. Why is that? And why is that? And do you think you can get out of that, going into the future?
I mean, look, I can't speak to the last 12 years. I've been here for a year and a half, but I think Recursion was one of the first companies to be really thinking about the wet, dry lab, the in silico end to end. Like, not a lot of people were thinking about it. So they were early in the game. Whenever you're one of the first, there's always going to be a lot of hot versus not and so forth. The second thing is, I think the company has focused a lot on generating data, creating data sets that haven't existed before. the AI space itself has gone through a lot of highs and lows. I think where Recursion is evolving to, which is a company, a medicines company that's focused on making better medicines using AI.
Mm.
That's a flavor of biotech and tech.
Yeah.
And tell me any biotech that's an iconic biotech that hasn't gone through a bumpy ride. Alnylam,
Yeah, they're
Regen,
not. They're not. Yeah, they're
they're
not.
not.
Yeah.
So I just take that as par for the course. I expect the hike to be hard and treacherous, Peter. I know what I've gotten myself into. But if the company can be successful, the reward is completely worth it. We will redefine how medicines are made, not just for one company, but the entire space, just like a lot of companies have done. So I think that's where the evolution is. Like, I think that's where the company is really going. We're excited about. And look, the other thing I'll say is a lot of the early stage or even current tech bio companies have focused a lot on data, models, novelty. How often have they focused on the end in mind, which is creating a drug?
Yeah, that's right. You know, it's
Not
very
for a long
interesting.
time.
We're talking about setbacks and so forth, and one of my personal hobbies is I like to study, successful people or famous people who've been successful and look at their lives. And I would say 90% of them had one or more major setbacks. We say, to think about just on the political side, Abraham Lincoln or, or FDR or any of these people, massive setbacks. If you look at people in business or if you look people in R&D and whatever in companies, the same thing. Instagram first went down one road that turned out to be totally useless. So they said, "Ooh, what could we do with the things we've invented?" And then they created the video part, which with the pivot. So I think you're right, which is fundamentally you have to be right more often than you're wrong. But
Yep.
important skill is the ability to pivot and adapt to change, because the one thing is almost certain is things will happen that you couldn't predict, right? And
And
so
I think we have pivoted, right? If you look at Recursion in the last year and a half, the pivot has been huge in terms of we're making drugs
mhm,
using AI, and we're trying to do it better, then faster, and at some point at scale. And I think that's been a big pivot from where a lot of these companies have been, which is focused much more on novel data, models, compute. Those are all critical ingredients. But what is the outcome? So I think that's to be expected. And like I was saying, with any biotech, with any company that's trying to disrupt, there's going to be bumps. I just expect that.
yeah.
But
So
are we learning from it quickly and fast enough is always the question.
yeah, that's right. Well, we don't have any questions, which maybe makes me worry a little bit that maybe something's wrong with the chat function.
Mhm.
But Michael, do you have any questions you'd like to ask Najat? We're heading towards the last, 5, 10 minutes of the session.
Yeah, yeah, really interesting. Great story too, Najat. I've met you a couple of times at Peter's conference.
Yeah.
I didn't know the backstory, so that's cool. Um, I don't know. I was kind of looking like, how do you? I mean, just kind of looking ahead. Like maybe like 3 to 5 years out. What do you think is going to separate the companies that truly apply AI, like it across across the end to end from those, because you hear about all these pilot projects, right? The pilot stuff and the public facing news. What's going to be the separator in your opinion?
Well, if it's in the life sciences, if that's the industry we're talking about, I think there's going to be two types of companies. One that are more SaaS focused, we're selling data models. Another is going to be we're making medicines that are hopefully better. I think for the former, it's really going to be around how repeatable can you make the use of those models and so forth from a customer perspective. So think a normal SaaS, like how generalizable are your models, how repeatable are your models, and so forth. And your data sets, are you able to aggregate a lot of the data sets, make it more useful? That's one. And I think the second is those that are actually making products and drugs and so forth, we're going to be judged by the drugs we make. Can we make them different in a way that's different from what others have done? And it's clinical data, Michael. It's always clinical data. If you're making a drug, proof is in the pudding. Can you actually get better data that's differentiated than what others have done before?
Yeah, that's right.
And, look, having a clear value proposition as to how AI data sets, models are helping you to do it, improve your probability of success, or time cost is going to be a critical factor. And, I always think like making drugs is thousands of steps. And that's why if you just have a point solution, it's very hard to do it better. You have to be able to be good in chemistry, biology, clinical development. There's so many regulatory, there's so many steps.
Yeah.
And you need to apply AI to the core areas that drive differentiation. It could be the molecule, it could be the inside of the target, or it could be how you pick patients in a trial. I think
Yes.
that's what's going to separate.
Yeah, and I
So,
do think that one of the important lessons out of all of this too is making sure that you run whatever it is that you're running with different perspectives. So, Najat is talking about you not only have to look, you have to look at the patient outcomes, you have to look at the R&D, you have to look at AI, you have to look at the different parts. But the other part you have to do is you have to look at the owners, the shareholders, whoever they are. Whether it's J&J, it's public shareholders. If it's a private company, and if you don't try to integrate the two, you will end up with failure because they're very, very tightly. That's why we're Young Part is a very unusual firm because we have first class corporate strategy. And Najat, I'm sorry to say, I started at Bain, you started BCG, so we were working at arch competitors. But also we do a first class investment banking, and those two, uh, that's another component that you have to take into account, whether it's thinking about AI strategy or a business strategy or whatever. Because you could do a wonderful job creating a drug, but if you structure yourself the wrong way, get money from the wrong people, whatever, you could end up with an unhappy experience. So, well, I think we are getting close to the end. I'm very confident somehow that the Q&A function isn't working because I can't imagine that we don't have any questions.
there's a couple of questions in Q&A I'm just
Sarah,
seeing.
do you see one? There we go. There's two. Is there two there? Hold on.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Here we go. Let me try. There we go. Oh, I see. There too. Okay, here we go. Uh, Mr. or Ms. Anonymous attendee says, how do you handle those confident AI hallucinations when we have generations of students coming up who don't have the capacity or training to think critically as they were taught with AI? Interesting question. Najat?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real problem. Can I just say, like, the number of people that are not thinking or learning how to think critically and rely on a chatbot is very concerning. And the way I think about it is, I mean, a lot of the hallucinations, sometimes it's not even hallucinations. Sometimes it's a response. It looks really good on first read, and then you dig into it and you're like, there's a lot of contradictions within the argument being made. I will always say, never lose your critical thinking capabilities. You have to be able to be independent in your thought. Like, I mean, I'm sure, Peter, you see this, and Michael as well. There are emails that are sent that you're like, this doesn't sound like this person, and or it's a lot of platitude and doesn't have insight. Insight really needs to be able to come from the person themselves, because not for any other reason other than the fact that the people who know how to use AI effectively will win versus the people who don't know how to use AI effectively. What I mean by that is the prompt strategy is so important. What questions you ask and critical judgment is going to be what holds the day. And you mentioned radiologists. Look, there's a lot of radiologists that use AI, but the ones that know how to ask the right questions, know how to train it well, those are the ones that are still coming on top. So I think critical questioning, judgment, and so forth, there's no replacement for that. And if you're a student learning, you should really know how to do the prompt piece much, much better and not over rely on AI.
Yeah, and Najat, I would totally agree with you. And also, the reality is AI is trying to tackle not just a rules-based analysis, which is easy, right?
Yes,
It's
exactly.
it's more understanding the relationship between things and high-level correlation, pattern recognition, and that you can't learn unless you do it, right? And a great example of how technology has been very damaging uh, is word checking, autocorrect. As a result, we have so many young people, they can't write, they can't spell because they
Terrible.
don't, they rely on, Microsoft Word checking, and it's a disaster. Next question. From a change management standpoint, what differences do you see in uptake, i.e., use of AI modeling with PE or venture-backed firms versus large pharmaceutical biotech? In other words,
Yeah.
how they use it. Are you utilizing the value proposition of speed to market and lower cost development as a major influence? And lastly, what hurdles are you seeing from a regulatory standpoint of view, which need proactive navigation? So there are like three questions in one. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just in the interest of time, I'll make it pithy. Large pharma is trying to use it, certain of them more at scale than I've seen before, which is great to see. I think PE and VC-backed companies are not using it enough at all. I think a lot of the biotech companies are still doing things in a very traditional way because resources are limited. I would really encourage them to at least use open source models, but for that, you still need a few data scientists that know how to use it, coupled with scientists. I think that's a big problem. Don't think biotechs are doing that enough. The question
Last
around
question. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
value proposition of speed to market and lower cost of development as a major influence. I think people are using the lever that they're focused on more as efficiency versus effectiveness. I think one has to do both. And what hurdles are you seeing from a regulatory standpoint that need proactive look? I mean, a lot of the guidances that are shared is great for how to use AI, ML, real world data. But when you go to the division level, that hasn't trickled through or cascaded all the way. So the actual experience when you're working on a specific program doesn't connect to, there's a lag factor from what guidance is being shared.
Yeah, there's a question at the end here, and we'll make this the last one. With AI and automation replacing most of the work scientists do you envision new roles for those scientists? Well, one is, I'm not sure the first part of the question is correct about doing most of the work scientists do, but Najat, your response to Monica's question?
Yes, I think it's going to supercharge scientists in terms of aggregating hypotheses faster, interpretability of data, and so forth. But think about what the best scientist actually does. They have to unpack gray areas of data and be able to creatively figure out the next set of experiments, killer experiments to run to make a go, no go decision. I think AI can help aggregate a lot of the data. I mean, are we there in terms of autonomous science where they can recommend the right experiments? For easy things, yes. For, again, critical thinking, back to that first question, no. So the way I see it is scientists who don't know how to use AI are going to be replaced by scientists that know how to use AI and know how to supercharge the key and critical decisions that need to be made. That's the difference. And you've seen that with radiologists, you've seen that with other fields as well.
Yeah, and by the way, I agree with that, Najat, but also two of the challenges. One is that the nature of creative problem solving, it's not clear. Even the people who are developing AI can't exactly tell you the exact nature of how it comes up and creates creative
Yep.
combinations of ideas. The other, though, is one analogy to answer Monica, your question is computer programming, right? We're going into a sad trap, which is AI is replacing basic programming, but we still need experienced, sophisticated people to be able to check the work and so forth. But in order to get to be experienced, sophisticated programmer, you have to start as a junior. So I think we're headed for a really serious problem, which is we don't have a pipeline of people who are going to become the sophisticated programmers that in fact will always be needed. So that is an analogy for the science thing, which is okay, maybe it might replace some of the early stage discovery stuff, but then how do you get scientists to the more advanced stage? That's a big problem. So with that, I really want to thank Najat for these wonderful insights. We learned about her big picture thoughts about the industry. We learned her wonderful personal journey, and she is proof that genetics really can really make a difference. Right? Although you did disappoint your parents not becoming a doctor, right? But the other is learn about how recursion is approaching it and trying to make AI something that's a very powerful weapon and will result in great change and results. So thank you very much, Najat. Thank you, Michael. It's been great to co-host. We look forward to co-hosting a few of these.
Yeah, definitely.
And hope to see some of you at the Younger Partners 22nd Annual Pharmaceutical Executive Conference. I'm getting a little old, I think, Michael, right? And both Michael and Najat were speakers last November, and they're so good we might have them speak again. So thank you all, and for those of you who want to binge watch this and watch it over and over again, we're going to do a little bit of editing, but then it's going to be available to all of you to watch when you want.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Najat. Appreciate it.